In the misty outskirts of Hollowmere, where the air perpetually smells of turpentine, there stands a house with a chilling secret. It's not haunted by ghosts or spirits. No, the Marrow House has a curse far more peculiar. It paints itself. Every few weeks a new picture appears on its walls. At first, just gloomy landscapes, but later, it started painting faces. The faces of people who had vanished without a trace. My name is Clara Wren, an art historian fascinated by cursed places and unclaimed paintings. When an anonymous tip led me to Hollowmere, I didn't hesitate. The Marrow House stood behind a gate of twisted iron vines, its paint peeling, its structure choked by ivy. A for sale sign leaned against the fence, years expired. As I pushed open the shrieking gate, the air hit me, a thick, cloying mix of linseed oil and decay. Inside, in the front hall, I found the first painting. A woman mid-30s, her auburn hair a mess, her eyes wide with raw, unadulterated terror. This wasn't a pose, it was a moment of fear, captured forever. The nameplate beneath it was simple, L. Morland. I checked my notes. Laura Morland, the previous owner, missing since 1992. Her case remains open. Coincidence, I muttered, dusting off the frame. But as I turned, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. The painting, it was wet. Fresh, glistening strokes of crimson had been added to her hair. The house's upper floor was a disorienting maze of rooms. In one, I found a studio. Easels were scattered everywhere, brushes overturned, and a thick layer of dust covered everything except for one single canvas. The painting on it was incomplete. Just a smudge of grey and flesh tones, the faint beginning of a portrait. There was no signature and no artist in sight. I set up my camera, determined to document this for my research paper. I took a few photos, then carefully locked the studio door behind me. That night I stayed at the local inn. The innkeeper, a woman with weary, knowing eyes, refused to take my money. "You shouldn't stay there," she warned, her voice barely a whisper. "No one does." When I asked why, she leaned closer. "Because the house doesn't like to be alone," she whispered. "It keeps its guests." The next morning, I returned to the Marrow House. The air felt heavier, almost humid with the stench of paint. I unlocked the studio, my hand trembling slightly. The unfinished canvas was no longer a blur of colors. It now showed the distinct outline of a woman, my posture, my dark hair. The resemblance was uncanny, disturbingly accurate except for one detail. The eyes were just empty voids of grey. I stumbled back, my mind racing. "No, that's impossible." Then I remembered my camera. I replayed the footage from the night before on my phone. At first, there was only static, then a faint flickering. The room began to glow with a strange, ethereal light, and shadows rippled across the canvas. There was no painter, no human hand, but the brush. The brush moved on its own. Frantically searching the studio, I found an old leather-bound journal in a desk drawer, dated 1947. It belonged to Edwin Marrow, the house's original owner, a portraitist famous for capturing the very soul of his subjects. One passage sent a shiver down my spine. "The paint listens when I sleep. It breathes with me, learns my hand. It whispers its hunger in color, crimson, umber, ochre. It does not want still life, it wants living life." Another entry was even more terrifying. "The pigment needs them near to remember them fully. It takes a little more each time, first breath, then warmth, then the eyes." The last page was a single horrifying phrase, scrawled over and over until the ink tore through the paper. "The canvas is the mouth." That evening, as a storm raged over Hollowmere, I sat before the portrait, lit only by a lantern. It had grown again. The color of my dress, the slight tilt of my chin, even the tiny scar above my eyebrow were all there. But the eyes remained blank. Thunder shook the house, rattling the paint jars on their shelves. I could almost swear the canvas itself was breathing. Suddenly, something wet dripped onto my hand. I looked up and froze in terror. A single line of red paint trickled from the ceiling. Then another and another, until dozens of crimson streaks were running down the walls. I followed the trail upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest, to a previously unnoticed attic door. As I pushed it open, a smell I'll never forget hit me. The metallic tang of copper mixed with varnish. The attic was a gallery of horrors. Hundreds of portraits covered every inch of the walls. Men, women, children, all staring out with hollow pits of black paint where their eyes should have been. And there, at the far end of the room, a figure leaned over a canvas, its brush moving slowly, deliberately. "Hello," I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure turned. It was me. A painted version of me, pale, hollow-eyed, smiling with my own mouth. I stumbled backward, my heart about to burst. The painted figure mirrored my every move, but then it raised its brush and began to fill in the eyes on the canvas. I screamed. The lantern flickered once, flared brightly, and then everything went dark. When I woke, dawn was filtering through the attic window. The canvas before me was finished. It was a perfect portrait of me, my eyes alive, my expression serene. My physical body, however, was nowhere to be found. Weeks later, the villagers found the Marrow house sealed shut again, the studio door locked from the inside, and hanging on the wall was a new painting with a small brass plate that read, "See Wren, 2025. Her eyes seemed to follow anyone who dared to enter the room. The innkeeper swears that on foggy nights she can still hear the faint sound of brushes on canvas, and a woman's voice humming a soft, lonely tune. The house had learned to paint again. A year later, a young couple bought the house, hoping to turn it into a modern gallery. They gutted it, repainted the walls brilliant white. But one evening, while hanging a new exhibit, the husband noticed a faint stain bleeding through the plaster. A face, half-formed. A woman's face. When he tried to paint over it, the color just bled through again. Deeper, richer, redder. By morning, the portrait was complete. Her eyes were wide open, and beneath her, a caption had appeared in fresh, dripping pigment. "Don't cover me. Thank you for joining me on this unsettling journey. If you enjoy stories that explore the darker side of art and history, please like this video and subscribe for more tales from the shadows. Stay curious and stay safe." They say some places hold memories, but what if a place could do more than remember? What if it could learn? What if it could speak? Welcome to the story of the Millbrook Forest, a place where the wind doesn't just blow through the leaves, it whispers your name, and once you answer, it never stops talking. This is where our story begins, with Lydia Grayson, a bright-eyed scientist from the University of Wessex. Lydia studied bioacoustics, the science of sound in nature. She was logical, practical, and didn't believe in ghosts or talking trees. When she heard tales of a forest that whispered to people, she saw the perfect subject for her doctoral thesis. She titled it Auditory Pareidolia and the Human Fear Response in Natural Soundscapes. In simple terms, she believed people were just hearing things, their brains tricking them into finding patterns in random noise. She was about to prove that the whispering forest was nothing more than a trick of the mind. She couldn't have been more wrong. Lydia arrived in the sleepy village of Millbrook, a cluster of old houses nestled in a valley, completely encircled by a dense, ancient forest of birch and oak. She rented a quaint stone cottage from an elderly woman, Mrs. Coates. Over a cup of tea, the old woman's hospitality came with a stark warning. "Be careful out there," she said, her voice low. "Don't go past the 3 stags." Lydia, ever the scientist, just smiled. "What stags?" she asked, already dismissing it as local folklore. Mrs. Coates's expression was grim. You'll see them. 3 wooden carvings, half rotted by now. Beyond them, the forest. It listens. Lydia thanked her for the tea and the advice, attributing it to charming, harmless superstition. That evening, she meticulously prepared her equipment. A high-powered parabolic microphone to capture distant sounds, a hydrophone for any streams she might find, and several motion-triggered recorders she planned to leave overnight. As dusk settled, the forest canopy became a shifting tapestry of shadows. The air was filled with the gentle hiss of wind through leaves and the distant mournful call of a thrush. It was peaceful, almost unnervingly so. The next morning, Lydia ventured into the woods, her boots crunching on fallen leaves. She was in her element, marking her path with bright tape, checking GPS coordinates, and setting up her first recording station near a beautiful grove of silver birch trees. Eager to begin, she slipped on her headphones to monitor the live feed. She heard the familiar rush of wind, the rustle of leaves, but then something else, something underneath the natural sounds. A voice. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like static crackling on a bad radio line. But then it cleared for just a fraction of a second. "Lydia!" She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She ripped the headphones off. Silence. Nothing but the wind and the gentle sway of the trees. She put them back on. The voice was gone. Only the normal sounds of the forest remained. "Audio feedback," she muttered, trying to rationalize it as she scribbled in her logbook. "Possible name projection caused by low-frequency wind resonance." It was a scientific explanation, a neat little box to put the anomaly in. But that night, back in the warmth of her cottage, as she reviewed the audio files, the whisper returned. Not just once, but multiple times. Each time it was faint but clear, and each time it spoke her name. On her second day, Lydia pushed deeper into the woods, driven by a mix of scientific curiosity and a growing unease. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and gnarled, draped in heavy coats of moss. The light grew dimmer under the dense canopy. Then she saw them. 3 decaying wooden carvings standing like skeletal sentinels. Stags. Their antlers had long since rotted away, but their silent watching forms were unmistakable. Mrs. Coates's boundary markers. Beyond them, the atmosphere of the forest shifted. It felt heavy. The air grew colder, and the soundscape changed. It wasn't just the random hiss of wind anymore. It was layered, rhythmic, almost like breathing. A slow, deep inhale and exhale that seemed to move with the shadows. When she stopped walking, the sound paused with her. To test her theory, she whispered a single word into her own recorder. "Hello." The forest whispered back, repeating her word with chilling, perfect accuracy. "Hello." Frequency echo, she told herself, her voice trembling slightly. Resonance from canopy movement. But the scientific explanations were starting to feel like flimsy shields against a truth she didn't want to face. That night, she dreamt of standing under black skeletal branches, seeing her own reflection staring back at her from the shimmering bark, as if the wood itself were hollow and filled with watching eyes. On the third evening, Lydia sat hunched over her laptop, her cottage feeling less like a refuge and more like a cage. She opened the audio file from Station 3, the one she'd placed right at the boundary of the 3 stags. It began normally, the crunch of her own boots, distant birdsong, the familiar rush of wind, and then the whisper. Only this time it wasn't just her name, it was her own voice. "Stop recording," it said, a perfect mimicry of her tone and inflection. "Turn back." A cold dread crept up her spine. She had never spoken those words. She checked the timestamps, her hands shaking. She had been hundreds of meters away, setting up another device when the recorder had captured that sentence. "It couldn't be me," she murmured to the empty room. But when she slowed the playback, isolating the sound, she heard something else woven into the fabric of her own voice. a different tone, deeper, raw, and ancient, as if something inside the very trees had learned her voice and was now speaking through it. The following morning, desperate for a human explanation, Lydia went to the village pub. Most of the locals avoided her gaze, shaking their heads when she mentioned the forest. But one man, a gaunt, weathered figure named Arthur Bell, beckoned her over. "You've been past the stags, haven't you?" he asked, his eyes knowing. "Yes," Lydia replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm studying sound propagation." Arthur let out a short, mirthless laugh. "Sound? You think that's just sound? That's memory, miss. The wood. It keeps what it hears. You talk in there long enough, it learns your voice, and then it starts talking back." Lydia frowned, clinging to her scientific training. "That's just folklore. It's echoes, nothing more." Arthur leaned closer across the sticky table, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Then tell me, Miss Scientist, when the trees start saying things you haven't said yet, what kind of echo is that?" She had no answer. That night, sleep was impossible. The forest loomed outside her window, its whispers seeming to seep through the glass. Just after midnight, unable to bear the silence of the cottage, she turned on her live recorder again, static. Then a new sound, faint but distinct, tapping, knock, knock, knock. It was coming from her back door. She froze, every muscle tensed. The tapping grew louder, 3 slow, deliberate knocks that echoed in the small room. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice a reedy tremor. There was no reply, just the howling of the wind. With her heart hammering against her ribs, she crept to the door and pulled it open. The wind rushed in, cold and sharp, and there on her doorstep lay one of her parabolic microphones. It was bent and broken. She had left that microphone deep in the woods, miles from the cottage, and leading from the forest edge all the way to her door was a trail of mud. In the mud were footprints, small, light and barefoot, like a child's. The next morning, Lydia had had enough. Q science be damned. She packed her bag, her only goal to retrieve her expensive equipment and get out of Millbrook forever. She found her first recording station easily. The device was smashed, its plastic casing shattered. The second was gone entirely. The third, the one deep beyond the stags, was still there. As she approached, an unnatural silence fell over the woods. No birds, no wind, a complete stillness that pressed on her eardrums, heavy and suffocating. She saw the recorder, its small red light still blinking. It was still recording. She snatched it up and hit the play button. At first there was only static. Then the forest itself seemed to breathe her name, Lydia. The voice came from every direction at once, a symphony of whispers. "Don't go." She stumbled backward, tripping over a root. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, surrounding her. The branches of the ancient trees began to move, creaking and groaning like mouths slowly opening, even though there was no wind. "You came to listen," the collective voice said, a chilling blend of her own voice and that ancient woody tone. So listen. The trees bent toward her, their forms twisting. The ground itself seemed to pulse, as if something monstrous beneath the roots had just exhaled a long, slow breath. Lydia screamed, and in the recording, the one a rescue team would find weeks later, her scream is not alone. Beneath her cry of pure terror, another sound can be heard, a voice that is ancient, deep, and made of splintering wood, and it is laughing. They never found Lydia Grayson. All that remained was her abandoned tent, her smashed equipment, and her final, frantic logbook entry. It read, "The forest is not echoing, it's remembering. It learns us, syllable by syllable, until it can replace us. The wind isn't wind, it's them." A month later, Mrs. Coates was woken by a knock at her door. When she opened it, a woman stood on her porch. She was pale, her clothes smeared with mud, and her eyes were dark, hollow pits. "Lydia?" Mrs. Coates whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. The woman smiled, a faint, empty gesture. Her mouth moved, but the sound that came out wasn't from her. It came from the trees behind her, a rustling whisper carried on the wind. "Hello, Mrs. Coates. I've come back to record more." And as the old woman stared in horror, Lydia's skin seemed to shimmer and shift, like the surface of bark in moonlight, faintly etched with the dark veins of wood. Her hair was tangled with moss and twigs. By dawn, both of them were gone. Only the forest remained, whispering. And if you ever find yourself near Millbrook, where the birch trees lean together like conspirators, and the wind sounds almost human, listen carefully. There are certain kinds of silence that feel alive. The silence of a workshop filled with unfinished faces, glass eyes staring from the dark, is one of them. It was the kind of silence that haunted Emile. He'd been the dollmaker's apprentice for almost 2 years, long enough to know his master, Gregor Vole, was different. Vole's dolls were famous from Vienna to Prague, admired by aristocrats for their eerie realism. Each one looked alive, too alive. People whispered that Vole used real hair, studied anatomy in secret, that his dolls could breathe when no one was looking. Emile used to laugh at those stories, but not anymore. Not since the night he saw one blink. Vole's workshop stood at the edge of the old quarter, a crooked house leaning into the wind, its windows always shuttered. Inside, the air smelled of varnish, glue, and something faintly sweet and rotten, like dried flowers. The walls were lined with shelves of heads, porcelain, wax, and carved wood. Some were smiling, some were crying, some just seemed to be listening. Emile worked at a narrow table, sanding a small arm until it gleamed like ivory. His master's footsteps echoed behind him, slow, deliberate. "Too much pressure," Vole murmured, his voice soft but heavy, like dust. "You'll bruise the grain." "Sorry, master," Emile said, pulling back. Vole leaned closer, his long fingers brushing over the doll's arm. "You must be gentle. They feel it, you know." Emile forced a smile. "They?" Vole just looked at him. "The dolls," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "They remember the hands that made them." That night, Emile dreamed of faces, hundreds of them, pale and blank, whispering in the dark. He awoke sweating, his heart pounding. Moonlight spilled across the workshop floor, and in that faint glow, he saw something that turned his blood cold. The doll he had been working on, the one with the half-finished arm, was sitting upright, its head turned slightly toward him. Emile froze. The eyes were still unpainted, just smooth porcelain, yet he felt them watching him. He stood up slowly, every nerve screaming to run. Then, just as suddenly, the doll fell backward with a soft clatter. He told himself it was the wind, but the shutters were bolted tight. The next morning, Vole seemed distracted. He moved through the workshop muttering to himself, checking the shelves, tapping on the wooden chests that lined the far wall. Emile noticed that one chest, the one with the iron lock, was slightly ajar. Curiosity got the better of him. Inside, wrapped in silk, was a head, a human one. Or so he thought, until Vole caught him staring and slammed the lid shut. "Curiosity," the old man said, his eyes sharp as glass, "is a dangerous habit." Emile swallowed hard. "What was that, master?" "A prototype," Vole said flatly. "Something imperfect, best forgotten." But later, when Vole went upstairs, Emile couldn't resist. He crept back to the chest, his heart thumping, and opened it again. The head lay motionless in its silk cradle, a woman's face, so perfectly crafted she looked as if she might wake at any moment. Her skin was pale, faintly translucent, and her lips were the color of old roses. He brushed his fingers against her cheek. It was warm. Emile yanked his hand back, stumbling into a shelf. Heads tumbled to the floor, eyes rolling, mouths frozen mid-scream. He tried to steady himself, and then he saw it. The woman's eyes were open. beautiful, isn't she?" Vol's voice came from the shadows. Emil turned slowly. The old man stood in the doorway, his face calm, his hands clasped behind his back. "She's my masterpiece," Vol said softly. "But she's missing something." Emil backed away. "You said she was a prototype." "I lied." The doll maker stepped closer, his eyes gleaming. "Do you know what makes perfection, Emil? It isn't just craftsmanship, it's sacrifice. You cannot give life to art without taking it from somewhere else." "What do you mean?" Emil whispered. Vol smiled faintly. "You'll see soon enough." He raised his hand, and before Emil could move, something struck him from behind. The world went black. He awoke on the work table. His wrists and ankles were bound with wire. The air smelled of hot wax and formaldehyde. Above him the great lamp blazed white, blinding. Vol stood beside him, rolling up his sleeves. "You have good hands, Emil," he said. "Steady, patient. It would be a shame to waste them." "Master, please!" Vol picked up a small knife. Its blade gleamed like a smile. "You've been an excellent apprentice, but my work requires more than skill. It requires youth. It requires life." Emil struggled, but the wires cut deeper. He felt the cold touch of the blade against his wrist. Then a crash. The window exploded inward, wind howling through. The lamp flickered. For a moment, the faces on the shelves seemed to turn toward him, their mouths opening in silent protest. Vol snarled, "Stay still!" But something was moving behind him. The prototype was standing. The woman's head turned toward the light, her lips parting. The wires that bound her limbs began to twist and snap, as though pulled by invisible hands. Vol froze. "No! No, you're not ready!" The doll took a step. Then another. Her voice was a whisper of silk and breath. "You promised me life." Vol dropped the knife, backing away. "You don't understand. You're not alive, you're—" The doll's hand closed around his throat. The sound that followed was wet and brief. When it was done, Vol lay still, his lifeless eyes staring at the ceiling. The doll looked down at her blood-stained fingers as if seeing them for the first time. Then she turned toward Emil. He held his breath, unable to move. She tilted her head, her expression almost tender. "He made me," she said. "Now I'll make you." When Emil woke again, he was on the floor. The ropes were gone. The workshop was silent. Vol's body was nowhere to be seen. He sat up, dizzy, and looked around. The prototype stood by the window, staring out at the dawn. Her skin seemed different, warmer, more human. "Are you alive?" he asked. She turned, smiling faintly. "You gave me life, Emil. You were the last piece." He frowned, confused, and then he looked down at his hands. They were porcelain, perfect. He screamed, but no sound came out. His throat was smooth, sealed, his voice stolen. The woman walked toward him, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. "You'll understand," she whispered. "Perfection must continue." She picked up Vol's tools, the knives, the brushes, the bone needles, and began to work. Weeks passed. The shop remained closed. The townsfolk whispered that old Vol had died and his apprentice had taken his place. But those who ventured near at night swore they saw light flickering behind the shutters and shadows moving where no one should be. Sometimes, they said, a voice could be heard, soft, metallic, pleading. And sometimes in the window they saw the face of a beautiful woman, her eyes shining like glass, smiling as she brushed dust from a shelf of perfect dolls. Each one had eyes that seemed to follow you. Each one looked like someone missing from the village. And on the work table, beneath a stained cloth, lay a new creation, almost finished, its hands porcelain, its face lifelike, its lips curved in a silent scream. The doll maker's apprentice lives on. He no longer needs sleep, food, or rest. He crafts endlessly, under her watchful gaze, building new perfection for a world that doesn't deserve it. The dolls remember the hands that made them, and sometimes they move. Thank you so much for joining me for this story. If you enjoyed this tale, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content just like this. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next video. The sea never forgets. That's what Elias Corr always told the new recruits at the Cliffside Lighthouse on Greyhaven Point. You can lie to yourself, you can lie to the waves, he'd say, his eyes fixed on the horizon. But the ocean remembers every sin we drop into it. He'd been the keeper there for 43 years, alone, mostly. No wife, no children, just the light, the winding stairs, and the endless whisper of the tide. But every night, as the storm winds howled and the foghorn moaned like a dying beast, Elias heard something else, a voice, faint but clear, just beneath the wind. It always called his name. The lighthouse itself was an ancient spiral of cold stone, streaked with salt and lichen, perched over jagged cliffs where the waves clawed like hungry hands. Inside, the walls wept moisture, and the air was thick with the scent of rust and old oil. Elias lived in the keeper's quarters at the base, a single room with a cot, a stove, and a small locked chest. That chest, he told himself, held the last secret he would ever take to his grave. Inside it, he had buried a truth. It was nearly midnight when the storm began. Rain hammered the glass panes of the lantern room, and the whole tower groaned as if it were alive. Elias wound the lamp mechanism, trimmed the wick, and watched its powerful beam slice through the churning darkness. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the sea, and for a heart-stopping second, he saw a ship. A massive vessel, its sails torn and snapping, dangerously close to the reef. Elias's heart seized. He hadn't seen a ship that size in decades. He scrambled for the radio, but all he got was static. Then through the roar of the thunder, a sound drifted that froze him to the spot, a bell tolling faintly from the water. Elias stumbled to the window, his breath fogging the glass. He waited, his heart pounding against his ribs. When the next bolt of lightning lit up the sky, the sea was empty again. No ship, no bell, only the roaring waves and the voice that now rose from them, whispering his name. Elias. He descended the spiral stairs, his lantern casting dancing shadows on the curved walls. He found the door at the base blown open, rain lashing across the stone floor. Beyond it, the night was a churning chaos of mist and spray. And there, standing at the very edge of the cliff, was a figure. She was dressed in white, her dark hair plastered to her by the rain. Her feet were bare, bleeding where they met the sharp stones. She turned slowly as Elias raised his lantern, and in its flickering light, her eyes seemed to glow. Clara, he breathed, the name a ghost on his lips, unspoken for decades. She offered something that might have been a smile. You promised, she said, her voice soft but cutting through the wind's shriek. You said you'd come back. Elias staggered backward, shaking his head. No, you're not. You can't be her. I waited, she whispered, her voice a chilling echo of the past. I watched the light every single night. You told me to trust it. You said it would keep me safe. Lightning flashed again, and in that blinding white instant, Elias saw her not as a spectre, but as she had been that night, standing on the deck of the Odessa, her hand raised in farewell as the fog closed in. He had sworn he would guide them through. He'd sworn the light would not fail. But it had. The lamp had died at 1:12 a.m. The oil line had burst. By the time he'd scrambled down with a torch to relight it, the ship had already struck the reef. Every soul aboard, including Clara, had been swallowed by the sea. Now she stood before him, soaked and spectral, her hair drifting like seaweed in the gale. Why did you let us drown, Elias? He collapsed to his knees, the lantern trembling in his grip. It wasn't my fault. The oil line, it failed. I tried. You promised, she repeated, gliding closer, her feet making no sound on the wet stone. You said you'd never let the light go dark. I didn't mean to, he choked out, tears mixing with the rain on his face. God forgive me, I didn't mean to. She stopped just a breath away. Her skin was the color of moonlight, her eyes as deep and dark as the ocean itself. The sea forgives nothing, she said, and it remembers everything. She leaned in, her voice a cold whisper against his ear. Come see what it remembers. And with that, she turned and walked straight off the edge of the cliff, vanishing into the storm. Elias screamed her name, dropping the lantern, which shattered on the rocks below. He ran after her, his boots slipping on the slick stone, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stopped at the edge, peering down into the roaring dark. Clara! He shouted into the void. The wind carried her voice back to him, a faint and sorrowful reply. Keep your promise. And then he saw it. Far below, beneath the surface of the waves, a faint golden glow began to sway, like the beam of his lighthouse reflected from the deep. It pulsed once, twice. His breath caught in his throat. It was coming from the wreck. Half mad, he stumbled down the treacherous cliff path, clutching the rock walls for balance. The tide surged up to meet him, cold and merciless. By the time he reached the shore, the glow had grown brighter, illuminating the churning water from below. He waded in. The cold was a physical blow, stealing his breath, but he kept walking until the sea reached his chest, then his shoulders. His lantern was gone, his own light extinguished. Only that golden shimmer remained, pulling him forward. He dove, and the world went silent. The water was a black, endless void. The glow below began to take shape. It was the Odessa, lying on her side, her ribs cracked open by coral and time. Her deck was coated in drifting sand, but the ship's bell still hung from the mast, swaying with the current. As he drew closer, faces began to appear, emerging from the silt, pale, bloated, their eyes staring up at him. Dozens of them, swaying gently in the deep, their hair rising like strands of kelp. And Clara stood among them, her hand reached for him, soft and weightless in the water. You kept the light too late, she seemed to murmur through the crushing pressure. Now you must keep it forever. Elias's lungs burned for air, but he couldn't look away. He reached for her hand, and everything went black. When he awoke, he was back in the tower. The lamp was lit, turning slowly on its gear. The storm had passed, and the sea lay calm and glassy beneath the dawn sky. For a fleeting moment, he thought it had all been a terrible dream. Then he saw the salt water pooling on the floor and the trail of wet footprints leading up the spiral stairs. He followed them to the top of the tower. The light still burned bright, but something was terribly wrong. The massive lens no longer reflected his own weary face. Instead, it showed the sea, and within its depths, countless faces looked up, their mouths open in silent accusation. Clara was there, her eyes glowing faintly. Keep your promise, her voice whispered, seeming to come from the glass itself. Elias reached out a trembling hand, and his reflection, a figure trapped within the lens, reached back. The glass rippled like water at his touch. 2 weeks later, when the new keeper arrived, the tower was empty. The bed was unmade, the lantern cold, the main door left ajar. The only thing left behind was the logbook, open on the desk. The last entry, written in a shaky, desperate hand, read, "The light must never go out again. She's waiting beneath the waves. If I keep it burning, maybe she'll forgive me. The sea remembers, and so must I." That night, as the new keeper climbed the stairs to check the lamp, he paused halfway up. He could hear humming, a woman's voice, faint and melodic. Though he told himself it was only the wind whistling through the stones, When he looked into the great lens, he swore he saw another face staring back from the other side. A man's face, his eyes hollow, his lips moving soundlessly in the timeless rhythm of the waves. To this day, the light at Greyhaven Point has never gone dark. Some say it's luck. Others say Elias is still there, keeping his promise. But on nights when the fog rolls in and the sea hums low against the cliffs, local fishermen whisper that you can still see a man inside the light. His face pressed against the glass, forever watching the water for a ship that will never return. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales from the edge of the map. We'll see you in the next one. The rain fell in thin, endless threads, slicing through the dim yellow light of the station's single flickering lamp. Midnight had come and gone, but Margaret still stood there, clutching her suitcase with trembling fingers, her reflection rippling in the puddles at her feet. The clock above the ticket booth had stopped at 12:03, but the sound of a train's whistle rolled through the fog like the cry of something alive. There were no other passengers, no staff behind the glass, only her, the night, and that sound, distant but drawing closer. She frowned, brushing the wet curls from her face. "There's no train scheduled," she whispered. She'd checked the timetable twice before the station lights began to dim, and the clerk, a tired man with hollow eyes, had sworn the last train had already gone. And yet the whistle came again, sharper this time. Margaret took a step toward the tracks. That was when she saw it, a faint glow far down the line, like the glimmer of an oncoming storm. It grew brighter, swelling into a beam that cut through the mist. The sound of wheels clattering on steel grew louder, and the ground trembled under her boots. The engine emerged from the darkness, a massive black locomotive glistening with rain, its sides engraved with curling silver letters that seemed to rearrange themselves as she tried to read them. The numbers 1903 shone faintly on its front. It stopped with a hiss, expelling a gust of cold steam that wrapped around her like icy fingers. The doors creaked open. Margaret hesitated. "Hello?" she called out into the strange silence. No answer. A faint golden light flickered from within. She saw the outline of red velvet seats, polished brass railings, and a long corridor stretching into shadow. It looked old, like something from a forgotten decade. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she stepped inside. The doors closed behind her with a definitive snap that made her heart jump. The interior was strangely pristine, as though perfectly preserved in time. Dust motes floated in the air, glittering in the dim light. A faint melody echoed down the corridor, a slow, haunting violin tune, the kind that made your skin crawl with a mix of nostalgia and sorrow. Margaret walked slowly between the seats, and that's when she saw them. There were other passengers. At first, she didn't notice them because they were so unnervingly still. But as she drew closer, she realized every single row was filled with people dressed in outdated clothes, men in bowler hats, women in lace veils, a child clutching a broken doll. Their skin was pale, almost gray, and their eyes were wide open. All of them, every single one, were staring directly at her. Margaret stumbled back, clutching her suitcase to her chest like a shield. "This isn't real," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The violin stopped, abruptly, and a new voice spoke, smooth and cold, from somewhere just behind her. "Ticket, please." She spun around. A tall conductor stood in the aisle, his uniform impeccably pressed, a cap pulled low over his eyes. His face was smooth and colorless, like porcelain, except for a faint dark line of soot streaked across one cheek. I don't have a ticket," she stammered, her words tumbling out. The station was closed. There was nobody there. The conductor smiled faintly, a chilling sight that revealed teeth too perfect to be human. "Everyone has a ticket," he said, his voice calm and even. "Some just forget where they left it." He held out a gloved hand, waiting. Margaret looked down, her gaze falling on her own suitcase. It had fallen open slightly, and there, nestled between her folded clothes, was a small, yellowed slip of paper. It looked ancient, creased, as if it had been handled 1,000 times before. With trembling hands, she pulled it out. The ink had faded, but she could still make out the words, "One way, Midnight Express, destination to be determined." The conductor nodded approvingly, his smile never wavering. "Now we can depart." Margaret's voice trembled, barely audible. "Depart where?" His smile widened, stretching unnaturally. "To the end of the line." The train began to move. Slowly at first, a low rumble beneath her feet, then faster and faster, until the world outside became a blur of grey and black. The windows flickered with strange, horrifying images, forests burning, oceans rising, entire cities in ruins, as though the train were traveling through time instead of space. Margaret gripped the seat beside her. "This can't be happening." The conductor walked past her, his boots clicking softly on the floor. "You boarded, Miss Reed. That makes it quite real." "How do you know my name?" she whispered, a new wave of fear washing over her. He paused and turned, his eyes catching the dim light. Two twin voids of black glass. "It's written on your ticket." Margaret's shaking gaze dropped back to the slip of paper in her hand. The words had changed. It now read, "Margaret Elaine Reed, departed 12:03 a.m. Status, confirmed." Her breath caught in her throat. No, I didn't die. I'm not." The conductor leaned close, so close she could smell the faint scent of smoke and cold ash on his uniform. "Everyone says that the first time." The lights flickered violently. Outside, absolute darkness swallowed everything. No moon, no stars, only the endless, dizzying blur of motion. The passengers, those still silent figures, began to stir. They turned their heads toward her in eerie, perfect unison. Their lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear at first. Then the whispers came, overlapping like static on a radio. "You shouldn't have come. You weren't supposed to board. You still have time." The train jolted, a horrible screeching sound like tearing metal filling the car, and the lights went out completely, plunging her into suffocating blackness. Margaret fell to her knees, fumbling desperately for her suitcase. When the lights flickered back on, the seats were empty. Every single passenger had vanished. Except one. A small boy sat in the very last row, his face pale and expressionless. His eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the dim gold of the lamps. "Where did they go?" Margaret asked, her voice cracking. "They got off," the boy said simply, "at their stops." A cold dread filled her. "And where's mine?" The boy tilted his head, a gesture that was somehow ancient and knowing. "You passed it already." The walls of the train began to shudder violently. The window beside her cracked, a spiderweb of fractures revealing flashes of something outside. Not sky, not land, but a roiling sea of faces, screaming silently as the train roared right through them. Margaret pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the silent screams. "Stop it, please!" The conductor's voice suddenly crackled through an unseen intercom, calm and impossibly distant. "Next stop, the crossing." The boy stood up. "You can get off there," he whispered, his voice a ghost in the rattling car. "If you're brave enough." When the train slowed again, she didn't wait. She ran. Through the corridor, past the empty seats, through the dining car where glasses still shook on the tables, though no one was there to drink from them. She reached the last door just as the train screeched to a final halt. Outside was nothing but thick, swirling fog. She stepped out onto a platform that stretched endlessly into the void, lit only by a few flickering lanterns. Behind her, the train's whistle sounded one last time, long and mournful, and then it began to pull away, vanishing into the dark. Margaret turned in a slow circle, lost and alone. But she wasn't alone. A figure stood in the mist just ahead, a woman, her outline faint but achingly familiar. "Mother?" Margaret whispered, tears blurring her vision. The woman smiled softly, a sad, loving expression. "You've come home." Margaret's heart ached with a pain that was both old and new. "Home?" The mist parted slightly, revealing a small wooden cottage, the same one she'd grown up in, the same one that had burned to the ground when she was 12, taking her mother with it. She took a hesitant step forward. "But that can't be." The woman held out her hand. "Come inside. It's cold out here." Margaret hesitated, torn. Then she heard it again, faint but unmistakable, the distant whistle of the train, returning. A second chance. She looked from the impossible vision of her past to the haunting call of the unknown train. And then she ran. Back toward the edge of the platform, back toward the sound. The ground crumbled beneath her feet as she leaped into the fog. The last thing she saw was the glow of the train's lanterns cutting through the mist and the conductor's gloved hand reaching out to catch her. Back at the station, the clock on the wall flickered back to life. It read 12:03 again. The clerk looked up from his newspaper as a lonely whistle echoed across the empty tracks. "Strange," he muttered to himself. "That train hasn't run in years." A sudden gust of cold air swept past him, carrying the faint, impossible scent of smoke and violets. And there, on the bench beside the ticket booth, sat a single yellowed slip of paper, as if left by a forgotten traveler. "One way, Midnight Express. Passenger Margaret Elaine Reed. Status: arrived. Thanks for joining me on this chilling ride." What do you think happened to Margaret? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories that linger in the shadows, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more mysteries. See you next time. The attic had always frightened Mara. It wasn't just the dust or the creaking beams. It was the feeling that the air itself was watching. The house had belonged to her grandmother, a stern woman who forbade anyone from entering the attic after dark. "Some things up there remember too much," she used to say, her voice always a low, serious hum. When Mara inherited the property, she dismissed those warnings as old superstitions, an old woman's spooky stories, nothing more. That was until the first night she heard the laughter. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like a child giggling just behind the walls. She searched the entire house, trying to convince herself it was the pipes or maybe a nesting bird. But the sound was elusive, always seeming to lead her upward, right to the attic door. The key was still there, hanging on a single rusted nail, just as she remembered. Against every screaming instinct, against her grandmother's warnings echoing in her mind, she unlocked it. The door groaned open with a sound of protest, as if it hadn't been moved in decades. Dust swirled in a single eerie beam of moonlight, revealing the forgotten shapes of a lifetime, all shrouded in white sheets. Old furniture, boxes filled with relics of the past. But one object stood out, commanding the space. In the far corner, taller than she was, stood a mirror covered with a heavy, dark cloth. Its outline seemed to hum with a faint energy, almost as though it was alive, breathing in the stale air. Mara hesitated, her hand hovering in the space between them. And then the giggle came again. This time it was clear, coming from right under the cloth. With a surge of adrenaline, she yanked the cloth off. Beneath it was a tall, ornate mirror, its frame a cascade of tarnished silver engraved with curling patterns that, on closer inspection, looked disturbingly like faces twisted in agony. Its surface wasn't clear glass. It was dark, rippling faintly like the surface of a still pond. She saw her reflection there, pale, uncertain, her lantern held tight in a trembling hand, and then, slowly, a detail that sent ice through her veins. Her reflection smiled. Mara did not. Her heart stuttered, a frantic bird trapped in her ribs. She stumbled back, certain it was just an illusion, a trick of the dim light. But then the reflection lifted a hand, just slightly, and traced a single finger along the inside of the glass. The sound was faint, but unmistakable, like fingernails scraping on ice. Then, as if from her own breath fogging the surface, words began to form, scrawled backward, but clear enough to read, "I remember you." In that exact moment, her lamp flickered and died. Mara fell backward into the suffocating darkness, fumbling with the lantern. When she finally managed to relight it, the mirror was clear again. Her reflection was normal. No smile, no writing, just her own terrified face staring back. But as her eyes scanned the glass, she thought she saw something else. A faint movement in the reflection, a small dark shadow darting behind the boxes. She spun around, heart pounding. There was nothing there. She left the attic immediately, slamming the door and locking it tight, her breath coming in ragged gasps. That night, she dreamed of the mirror. She was standing before it again, but this time she was surrounded by whispering voices, a chorus of unintelligible murmurs. The children's laughter she'd heard before echoed around her, growing louder and louder until it twisted into piercing, desperate screams. Then she saw them. Faces pressed against the other side of the glass, dozens of them, their mouths open in silent shrieks, their eyes wide with a terror that felt ancient. When she tried to run, her own reflection reached out, its hand passing through the glass as if it were water, and grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward the surface. She woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. Morning sunlight spilled through the window, a welcome but weak defense against the chilling memory. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She decided she'd call someone, an antique dealer, maybe a junk removal service, to get the mirror out of the house for good. But when she went upstairs to check on it, her blood ran cold. The attic door, the one she had firmly locked, was already open, and the mirror was no longer in the corner. It stood in plain sight at the top of the stairs, as if waiting for her. She hadn't moved it. For the next few days, the strangeness followed her like a shadow, flickers of movement in her peripheral vision, the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway when she was completely alone. Once, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the hallway mirror. It was smiling that same chilling smile, even though her own face was a mask of fear. She began covering every reflective surface in the house with sheets and towels, desperate to escape its gaze. But still, she could feel it watching. One evening, while sorting through her grandmother's belongings for a distraction, she found an old photograph, a faded family portrait taken decades ago. Her grandmother stood beside a group of solemn-faced children, probably from the orphanage she once ran. But as Mara's eyes scanned the background, she froze. Almost out of frame stood that same mirror, the silver frame, the same swirling engravings. And in its dark reflection, one of the children from the group was missing. A cold dread, sharp and absolute, ran through her. That night, armed with a camera, she returned to the attic. She had to know. The mirror seemed different now, brighter somehow, as though lit from within. Her hands trembled as she raised the camera. She took a picture. The flash exploded against the glass, and in that blinding split second of light, she saw it all. It wasn't just a few faces, it was hundreds of them, pressed against the glass from the inside. Small, pale, screaming faces of children, a silent, writhing mass of trapped souls. The sound that followed wasn't human. It was a deep, guttural moan that seemed to come from the very bowels of the mirror, making the air around her vibrate. The glass began to fog over, and again, words formed. "You forgot us." Her camera slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor. The attic's single light bulb burst, plunging everything into darkness. And then came the sound of breathing, soft, wet, and right behind her ear. Mara turned and saw her reflection standing beside her in the gloom, no longer just smiling, but grinning with a wide, predatory malice. She screamed and ran for the stairs, slamming the attic door shut behind her. But as she huddled on the landing, she could hear the whispering continue from above, soft, endless, and calling her name. Days passed in a blur of sleepless terror. The mirror's whispers bled from her dreams into her waking hours. Her eyes became hollow, her skin pale. She was a ghost in her own home. Finally, she decided she had to end it. She had to destroy it. She climbed the stairs one last time with a heavy hammer, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and resolve. The mirror seemed to glow faintly as she approached. For a single heart-stopping moment, she thought she saw the children inside, pressing their tiny, transparent hands against the glass, their eyes pleading silently. A wave of pity washed over her. "I'll set you free," she whispered, her voice cracking. Then she raised the hammer and swung with all her might. The mirror shattered, but instead of glass, a thick, black smoke poured out, swirling around her like a vortex, whispering in 1,000 voices, "We remember." She screamed and stumbled backward. The attic light flickered violently, then went out for good. When the neighbors finally came to investigate the noise days later, they found the attic door wide open. Inside, the mirror stood perfectly whole, without a single crack, gleaming in the dusty air. But Mara was gone. All that remained were footprints in the dust, leading toward the mirror and stopping abruptly at its edge. Weeks later, a new family moved in. They found the mirror beautiful, a fine antique, and decided to keep it in the attic playroom. Their young daughter loved playing near it. One morning, she told her parents she'd made a new friend in the mirror. "She says her name is Mara," the little girl said, smiling brightly. "She says she remembers me." That night, the parents heard faint laughter echoing from the attic, soft, distant, and undeniably wrong. When they went to check, their daughter was sound asleep in her bed. But the mirror at the far end of the room glowed with a faint internal light, and on its dark, rippling surface, new words had appeared. "We remember you too." Thank you for joining me on this chilling tale. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next descent into the darkness. Stay safe and always be careful what you see in the reflection.